This linking of the freedoms that we were fighting for abroad and the need to protect the economic interests of our country's most vulnerable was very explicit. FDR said, "Necessitous men are not free men. Poverty is a breeding ground for tyranny." FDR understood that economic and social rights are intimately linked to the civil and political rights that most Americans think of as their basic rights. The rights to vote, fair trial, freedom from cruel treatment, freedom of religion, and speech. So after the war, FDR helped to create the UN, and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, had a key role in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This explicit link was again made, linking civil and political rights standing interdependent and interlinked with economic and social rights. But there's more to the story than just FDR and Eleanor. It's also Walter White and W.E.B. Du Bois and other famous names from the NAACP and the early civil rights movement who saw this link and the linking of the rights of poor and minority people here in the U.S. to international standards as part of their campaign. Many people around the world saw the founding of the UN after World War II as an essential step towards promoting human rights and removing the threat of future wars and abuses like the Holocaust from the earth. This included the children of former slaves here in the U.S. who were still experiencing segregation and Jim Crow laws at the time that were much like the Jewish codes that preceded the Holocaust in Germany. The NAACP itself was still emerging then, and they had tried to use the U.S. legal system, but they had time after time been turned back, and this was long before Brown v. Board. They tried to use the legislative system, but they couldn't get any federal legislation passed because of the filibuster threat of Southern Democratic senators. So when they saw this opportunity for a law higher than U.S. law, based on universal principles of basic human dignity, with the potential to be shaped not just by the great powers, but by people from countries that actually looked like them, they knew this was an opportunity that they couldn't miss. So they were there in 1945 in San Francisco for the founding of the UN, where W.E.B. Du Bois lobbied specifically for the NAACP to be attached as part of the official U.S. delegation so he could ensure that human rights were included as part of the UN's mandate. And they were there as Eleanor Roosevelt drafted the Universal Declaration. And they were there not to just let these great words sit idly on paper, but to use them as part of their activism, bringing the first petition ever to the UN, a report by the NAACP entitled An Appeal to the World, in 1947, laying out the case of systemic discrimination in housing, education, voting, all the rights the UN system was supposed to protect. But because there was this great potential, there was also great opposition. And that's when the divide between the human rights the rest of the world gets to enjoy and the civil rights that we were allowed here in the U.S. began. Because in the U.S., especially those Southern Democratic senators, saw any indictment at the international level of the U.S. as simply giving material to the communist countries to use in their propaganda that the capitalist democracy wasn't the best and it wasn't what it seemed. And it was just where the U.S. was weakest that this dual system of inequality that was Jim Crow, that went against all the principles of non-discrimination and equality that the U.S. was based on, or the UN was based on. So the Southern Democrats threatened the Eleanor Roosevelt and the Truman administration, saying none of Truman's legislation would pass if he tried to make these international treaties effective here in the U.S. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who was on the board of the NAACP, then threatened to resign if the NAACP did not withdraw their petition. And so after a lot of discussion, they reluctantly did withdraw the petition. And just as this was happening, the first victories of the civil rights movement started to happen domestically. Then we got Brown v. Board and Fair Housing Act and all the rest. And so the civil rights movement started going with this domestic system of civil rights, even though they originally pinned their votes on this human rights framework. And it was in this context of racism and the Red Scare, all of which is chronicled in much greater depth in Carol Anderson's excellent book, Eyes Off the Prize, for those of you who want to find out more about it, that what was supposed to be this universal system of human rights with economic and social and civil and political standing side by side, that it was split into two treaties. The Universal Declaration is just a declaration of principles, but it's codified into treaties that countries ratify and then combine them. So we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, containing most of the rights in the Bill of Rights that we think of: freedom of speech, religion, fair trial, etc., supported by the Western nations, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, supported by the Eastern Bloc and by many civil rights advocates here in the U.S. And this includes all the rights that we are looking for substantive equality: education, healthcare, housing, etc. So as they started seeing this progress in the domestic system with Brown v. Board and Fair Housing Act and others, they started to think they were getting at those rights. But these were all based on the Equal Protection Clause, so they only created the right to non-discrimination in those rights, but they didn't guarantee the rights themselves. And unlike the international system that says that both intentional and non-intentional discrimination in those rights have to be remedied, most of the time in the domestic system, you have to prove intentional discrimination, which means that even though we have a population that's only 13% African American, but African Americans represent 50% of the homeless population, if you can't prove that's intentional, you can't get a remedy. So while they made some initial and important gains, ultimately we're left without what we really wanted: the right to true equality, the right to an adequate standard of living. It actually took the U.S. until 1994 to even ratify the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And although the Economic Rights Treaty was signed by Jimmy Carter in 1978, it is still yet to be ratified. So that's where we are today. The rest of the world has been talking about the right to housing, the right to food, the right to health for the past 50 years. From Scotland to South Africa, people have been grappling with what those rights mean and how to make them real. And that brings us back to where I started out, which is, what does it mean when housing is a human right? Each of the human rights treaties under the UN have committees that oversee their implementation. The Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights monitors the countries that have ratified the treaty, and they draft what are called general comments, which are sort of like regulations under U.S. law. We have statutes that lay out legislation in broad terms, but then it's the regulations that get down to the details. And in the Economic Rights Treaty, it says there's this right to housing, but it's the committee general comment number 4 that I mentioned before that really fleshes it out. And even though we haven't yet taken the step of ratifying that treaty, these standards are still relevant for advocacy, and I think you'll soon see how that is. So general comment 4 says that there are 7 elements that make up adequate housing: legal security of tenure, availability of services, materials, and infrastructure, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. I'll talk about a few of these so people get the idea, but just so you all know, all of this information about these treaties and general comments and all is available on the materials on your CDs, and it's also on our website, which is on the sheet in front of you, so you don't have to worry about trying to remember it or write it down. So let's start out with the legal security of tenure. This means that part of the right to housing is the security of knowing that it can't be arbitrarily taken away from you. And that's going to mean different things to different people. It could mean getting the right to legal protection in landlord-tenant court for a rental. It could mean getting protection from foreclosure for a homeowner. It could even mean the right to stay in a tent city, or the right to sleep on a sidewalk if there isn't anywhere else to go for a homeless person. In any case, it's clear that the U.S. has a long way to go to meeting this aspect. Let's look at affordability next. Many of you know that under HUD guidelines, affordability is usually defined as being 30% of a household's income. And even under that standard, we know that the U.S. is failing dreadfully, that millions of families are severely rent burdened, many paying more than 50% of their income for housing, which clearly puts the rest of their well-being in danger. And that's how the international system defines affordability. Housing is affordable when it doesn't threaten your other basic needs. So every time a family